So I've been in this field since 1979, and I'm a yoga educator, and I use the term educator with great intent and clarity, as opposed to teacher, or especially as opposed to therapist, and I'm sort of on record on how I feel about those terms. So I'm actually in favor of clearly defining the terms we use in conversations. Now, if you read things on the internet, you'll learn a lot more about me from various sources. Some of those things are saying not so nice things about me. And a lot of this stems in the last month or so from the fact that I gave an interview to Michelle Goldberg, who is working on an article for Slate, which is an online magazine. And the topic, she told me, was the cult-like atmosphere at Jivamukti. Now, she knows that I had an association with Sharon and David, who founded Jivamukti back in the 90s, in the early 90s when I taught there, and that I have some history there and maybe something to say about it. And this was all prompted, of course, by the fact that there is a lawsuit that was brought by a former teacher at Jivamukti against a senior teacher at Jivamukti, and it's a workplace sexual harassment lawsuit. And one of the key elements in this dispute is going to hinge apparently on the atmosphere at Jivamukti. And so Michelle wanted me to talk about that. She wasn't consulting me for my legal expertise, of which I have none. She wasn't necessarily consulting me on my first-hand knowledge of what was going on right at that moment at Jivamukti, because I hadn't taught there since 1994. But she wanted to know a little bit of the history and background I had. And my understanding of what went into it. And I agreed, and I felt like I did the right thing by agreeing to go on record. In fact, it didn't occur to me to even ask her if anyone else she was talking to was willing to be on record. And apparently I was the only one. See, so she had some quotes from people, but they were anonymous quotes. So since I was the one on record, naturally, I'm the one who's getting a lot of flack for some of the things I said. And I wanted to clarify that the quotes were accurate. I had no problem at all with how I was quoted. I enjoyed reading the article. I thought she did a good job. I enjoyed Michelle's writing. I enjoyed very much her book about Indra Devi called The Goddess Pose, which he came here to the Breathing Project to talk about right after it was published. So I knew Michelle a little bit from that. But being quoted accurately is one thing. Being quoted in context is another. And because I said a lot of things in that hour-long plus conversation with Michelle, what I wanted to do was give some more of the context of what I said. And I have here the entirety of my quoted remarks from the Slate article, so I don't mess up. So the first quote was about Sharon, Gannon, David Life explicitly saying, this is back in the early 90s when I was teaching there, that their mission was to re-mystify yoga. Even back in the early 90s, they saw yoga drifting away from what they considered to be its mystical roots. So this is how they explicitly stated their mission on more than one occasion, to re-mystify yoga. And the next quote in the article is, there are certainly people who go to Jivamukti just to get a workout, but the people who stay and do the teacher trainings are the ones who really resonate with their message philosophically. They've never been shy about what their message is and what their philosophy is. And it involves surrender to the people that are in charge. And this started in sort of end of 93, beginning of 94, when they started their first in-house teacher training program. They didn't charge for it. But they did make you do a whole lot of karma yoga free labor. And you were following directions from beginning to end, and you just had to do everything that was asked of you. And in addition to that, and that was the major culture change of early Jivamukti into what it has become now. Because in addition to having their own in-house teacher training and all of these people who are willing to run around and do whatever they're being asked to do, there was also this sort of shift in how Sharon and David perceived whether people were being loyal to them or not. And my case is a prime example. I had been teaching there for a while. I taught a beginner's class in the big room 1 day a week. And I was friends with Sharon and David. I was their body worker. I worked on their bodies. I helped put them back together when they came back from India, and all of that. We worked together on projects. And I thought it was a really cool place. It was eclectic. It was the happening place. There was a lot of amazing energy and a lot of different teachers and a lot of different styles taught there. And what I was told was that if you wanted to teach at Jivamukti, you had to come to satsang once a week. Well, sorry, once a month. Minimum of once a month. Sorry, once a month. And it was the requirement thing that told me the way things were shifting there, because, and David is the one who told me this. I remember the conversation very clearly. And he knew that I came out of sort of an ashram background, and I love me some satsang. I love me some kirtan, and I when I was a Swami with the Shivananda organization, that was part of my job description. I was the guy that led the meditations and the satsang and the chanting, and I still love doing that. But I wasn't invited to come to a satsang. If they had said, we're starting to get people in these satsangs and we're asking all of our teacher trainees to come, and we know that you like to chant, would you be willing to come? And if it was an invitation that way, I'd have jumped at it. But this idea that it was now like a requirement. And I said no. And I said, this is not for me. And it's clear that, that I'm not going to be able to teach here anymore. And David said, well, for you, we can make an exception. And I said, no, you really shouldn't do that. If you have a rule, you have a rule and you stick to the rule. And that was in '94. And the only regret I have about that is that I missed meeting Krishnadas by about 2 months. If I had gone to just a couple of satsangs, I'd have been at the very first few satsangs that he went to and started chanting at Jivamukti. And the only reason there were people in the room to chant with was because of this rule they had that their teachers had to come to satsang. So I could have been friends with him for 10 more years. We're good friends now, but we missed 10 years of that friendship. That's the only regret. But it was clear to me the way the culture was going at Jivamukti. And this loyalty thing kept coming up again and again from everything I heard about people that were teaching there. And again, it's ironic, because when they first started Jivamukti, they were basically Shivananda teachers. They had been trained by the Shivananda organization, which was my mother organization. And there was a very strong influence, and they wanted to honor Shivananda and their roots, and their training. But it was eclectic. They were introducing other elements, and music in the class, and more flow, and this was before they met Pattabhi Joyce. They were doing more dancey, flowy type practice. But it was clearly, you could see a Shivananda base in terms of the sequence and the postures that were selected. And what they heard from the Shivananda organization was that you are by no means allowed to use the name Shivananda to describe what you're doing, because you're not teaching Shivananda yoga. And Sharon and David were devastated. They were really, really upset that they felt that they were being told that they were being disloyal to Shivananda. So again, this is a bit of irony, because they then turned their culture around into this situation where you had to be constantly proving your loyalty to Shivananda, to Jivamukti. And it happened again and again. And one of the major events in this saga is when they lost their Ashtanga program. Because they had a strong Mysore Ashtanga program. This is by the time they had moved to Lafayette. This is when they were in Lafayette. I taught when they were on 2nd Avenue. And the problem for David and Sharon was that all of their Ashtanga teachers who were teaching at Jivamukti were practicing with Eddie Stern at this point. But they found that to be very disloyal. And they told their Ashtanga teachers that if you teach at Jivamukti Ashtanga, you have to practice Ashtanga at Jivamukti. And all of the teachers all at once basically said, and they left. And that's why the Shala is there on Broadway. That's how the Shala got started. That was all of those Jivamukti Ashtanga teachers who said, screw you, we're going to practice wherever we want, and now we're going to teach wherever we want. And so they moved. So this loyalty thing kept coming up over and over again. And the reason I'm going into such detail with this is that this is some of the concepts I was trying to share with Michelle about, why they are perceived as having a cult-like atmosphere at Jivamukti, because you had to constantly prove your loyalty, and not just loyalty to the rules and what they said you should do and who you should study with and what you should study, but also just to their philosophy. And they've never, as I said, been shy about what that is. They are radical, I would say militant, vegan animal rights people, to the point where they're infamous for showing films of slaughterhouses during yoga practice classes, right? And again, as a student, you can take it or leave it. If you don't like that, you don't have to come back to class. But if you do buy into that mindset and go through their teacher training and want to be part of that culture and to teach there, okay, there's a big buy-in, philosophically in terms of this point of view. And my view on that is that there's a line that one crosses with asserting animal rights where you go from being in favor of treating animals well and go into treating humans very poorly. So the more pro-animal you become, the more anti-human your perspective becomes. And that is a deep current that underlies what's happening there. And it goes into also their feeling about people having children. That more humans on this planet is not a good thing. It's not a good thing for the planet, and it's not a good thing for the animals on the planet. And so this is the mindset, okay? And again, a student coming for a class, they're coming for a workout, maybe they put up with the lecturing, maybe they put up with the slaughterhouse film, but they get what they want and they leave. But the teachers who get trained and who stay and who want to be there and want to move up through the ranks, there's a big, big buy-in. And so you've already bought into a whole lot by the time you're asked to do some of the things that this teacher is claiming she was asked to do by her guru, right? And going back to what's being claimed in this suit. So, speaking of the suit, this is the next quote by me in the article, and this is the one I'm catching most of the flack for. This seems to me to be a very nasty way for a jilted lover to get back at somebody. This woman was certainly okay with the relationship until she found someone else. This teacher may have been under her guru's spiritual sway, but she's still a consenting adult. We're not talking about people with diminished capacity. You can talk power imbalance as much as you want, and that's certainly part of the conversation, but the power these teachers have was given to them by their students. This is the quote that has me labeled as a victim-blaming, insensitive, fill-in-the-blank, right? So that takes a little explaining, I think, because I understand how some people hearing that would get upset. And people have a perfect right to be upset. It doesn't mean they're perfectly right, okay? Having an emotional reaction to something doesn't mean you're correct. about having an emotional reaction, about the thing you're reacting to. So, given how much buy-in there has to be to even become a teacher of Jivamukti, into this culture, into doing what you're told, doing what you're asked, and how you move up the ranks, how you get to be a special person in a situation, in an atmosphere like that. This teacher who's now turning around and claiming that this is workplace sexual abuse. By the way, Matthew Remsky in his blog characterized it in the title as a sexual assault case. And that was the first time I heard anyone call this a sexual assault case. I don't know why he chose to use that word, okay? And I don't think anyone, including her lawyer, at least, has characterized it as sexual assault. Okay? It's sexual coercion, sexual abuse, whatever legal terms they're using, okay? My point is that it's not a powerful way to go through life, is to identify with the victimhood of a situation, when clearly there are so many choices that have been made along the way where you're buying into the situation, when you're doing what you're asked, even if your gut is screaming at you that this is fucked up, what I'm being asked to do. But what makes someone stay in that situation? And so then you get into the psychology of someone that maybe has a history of abuse and wants to feel special and all of that. And it was really about feeling special that this was fundamental. And this is her own words. It was how special you get to feel in that situation. And the thing that broke it for her was when Ruth turned her attention to another student and she wasn't so special anymore. And that's when the walls caved in for her. So my point was that when I first read the account, it was in the Post, in the news, it was in the the dailies. This became a tabloid thing right from the beginning. Right from the beginning. And I wondered, how did the papers get hold of this information? Now I know the court records are open, and so there's reporters who trawl the records for juicy things, and this is juicy. Okay, I understand that this initial sort of making it a tabloid piece may not have been the way this teacher and her lawyer wanted it to go. And yet, accompanying one of the articles, I think it was in the news, was a photo of the teacher clearly taken in her lawyer's office with all those legal books in the background. So they had no problem, I guess, sort of prosecuting this case in the court of public opinion. I have a problem with calling this person a victim. And I need to explain that because it can sound cruel and it can sound insensitive. But the analogy I would make is this, because I was asked, I was given plenty of opportunities to walk back these quotes and to say, I'm sorry, I was misquoted, and I wasn't going to throw Michelle under the bus that way because she quoted me accurately. And I meant everything I said. So the thing I wanted to say about this, and this is me being an educator, everyone here is doing their job. Her lawyer's doing her job, the blog writers are doing their jobs, I'm an educator. Here's me doing my education job. I was asked, would knowing about this teacher's history of childhood sexual abuse have changed what I said? Should it have changed what I said? And I thought about that. I thought long and hard. And my first reaction was, well, that really sucks. That someone with that history got involved in this situation. But this so many people have that history. And so many people react so differently to having had that history. It reminds me that there's stuff that happens that we didn't choose. But then there's how we respond. How we chose to respond to the things we didn't choose. Let me give you an example that I thought of. Because there's like two major categories of basically shit you didn't choose. There's nature and nurture, right? You hear this all the time. There's nature. There's your genetic inheritance. It's the genes you got from your parents. You have no choice about that. I don't buy the karma thing where you're reincarnated for whatever. That's victim blaming. When people come to me with, I just want to slap in the face with it. someone is suffering and say, oh, you did something in the past lives, like, just shut the fuck up, right? So there's your genetic inheritance, we'll call that nature. And then there's like the environment that you were born into and how you were treated, how other people treated you when you were young. You have no choice about that either. That's nature and nurture, right? So let's take an example from the nature side. Let's say you're born with this genetic defect. It's a form of albinism, actually. You may have seen people at the beach like this who are covered. Like their skin is completely covered from head to toe, hats, the whole thing. And they're you ever seen anyone like that? They have that genetic defect, it's a form of albinism, and it makes them extremely vulnerable to the UV radiation from the sun in terms of skin cancer and all that. And yet they go out and they try to enjoy their lives, but they have to protect themselves, right? So, is someone born with that particular defect more or less likely to develop skin cancer, would be my question. And how can you know the answer to that question? You would have to know how they respond, how they behave in the face of that knowledge, that they have this vulnerability. Can you see where I'm going with this? So on the nurture side of it, a lot of people, based on their early experience of how they were treated and if there was abuse there and all this other stuff, have these vulnerabilities. How do you respond to it? Do you suppress it so you don't even remember it? Do you remember it and try to take some action to keep yourself out of situations where those vulnerabilities will be exploited? How you respond to having been a victim of something determines the outcome, just like the skin cancer thing. I would say, based on the way certain people respond to that genetic defect, they'll be the least likely people to get skin cancer because they'll be the ones who are most protecting themselves against UV radiation. They're not going to walk into a tanning parlor. They're not going to stroll down the beach wearing a tiny little bikini or just sunbathe with, like a reflector or something like that, right? So my point is that there's nature and nurture versus free will, the choices we make. And so my response to that question, would I have said this differently had I known that this teacher had this history? I would say no. I would say no. Because choices were made. Choices were made knowing what the history is and the potential vulnerabilities. Questionable decisions about personal boundaries. That's what this is. And this is how lessons get learned. And that goes to the last quotes from the article. As spiritually advanced as people like to believe these folks are, we're talking about the senior teachers, there's some very fundamental psychological dynamics going on that are completely opaque to the people involved. I don't necessarily think that Sharon and David started out thinking we're in the business to become gurus and have people worship us. But the projections that happen in an intense situation like that are very, very strong. There's not a single spiritual organization I know of that has escaped this, if they have a charismatic leader sitting at the top of it. And Jivamukti has 2 charismatic leaders, and other teachers have become charismatic leaders in their wake. Let me say this in a way that cannot be misunderstood. If you're in a situation where people are willing to literally worship at your feet, and that doesn't turn your stomach, there is something seriously wrong with you. That's just, I don't know any other way to say that, right? I mentioned that Krishnadas is a friend of mine. He constantly has people coming up to him after concerts, wanting to touch his feet, treating him like a guru or some divine personage, and it absolutely drives him crazy. And he has to kind of sit still for it. Because some of these people are from India and they have this tradition of touching the feet and all that, and he acknowledges that, but it makes his skin crawl. And rightly so, I think. So there's some dynamics going on there. And I'm personally familiar with these because I was a Swami back in the early 80s. And that leads me to the last thing I want to say about this. Because the rules, the ethical guidelines, the vows, the boundaries, that's what makes these situations so highly charged. Because it's the transgression of those boundaries that is so seductive. That's what ramps up the prana and the energy in sometimes sexually provocative ways that get acted on. So just by putting a bunch of rules on the wall about what your center's policy is, about student-teacher relationships, okay, that does not solve the problem. That creates the situation that makes the problem more likely to happen, because it's the transgression of the rules that is a turn on. Trust me on this. And that's why I'm not jumping on a bandwagon and plastering the Breathing Project's policy about student-teacher relationships here, okay? Let's bring a little more psychological savvy to this conversation instead of just saying we need rules and we need to follow them. It's the breaking of the rules that is the turn on. It was for me. It really was. Well, I learned about myself from the consequences of breaking the rules. I learned what was driving me, what was missing in me, where I felt powerless, where I felt unloved or unlovable and was trying to fill that void. And that's where this power imbalance conversation doesn't work. Because you're just looking at the very, very surface of what's going on. And you say, oh, the teacher has the power and the student doesn't. Well, let's just look at some basic laws of physics. First of all, energy flows from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. You're looking at the direction that it's flowing and saying, there's the power over there. Where is it coming from? It's going into a void. And the void is on the side of the teacher, the one who's supposedly in power. Think of that. That's just physics. And also think of the fact that whenever an energy is moving somewhere in the universe, there has to be a corresponding energy, equal and opposite, going the other way. These things are under the surface. These are the deep subconscious psychological patterns that drive people into these situations and keep them into these situations and eventually explode these situations, because we're all trying to learn lessons about ourselves. And just putting some rules on the wall doesn't solve the problem. I'm not saying we shouldn't have rules. We should understand what rules do to people. So the last quote, which was the one that got called the mic drop quote, it wasn't the last thing I said to Michelle, it was the last thing she chose to put in the article, was, and this is the last paragraph of the article, perhaps this case will cut through some of the self-mythologizing grandiosity that has sprung up around a place that is ultimately just a yoga studio. That, says Kaminoff, would represent genuine spiritual development. What the fuck was I thinking? Is probably the mantra that some of these people need to be repeating to themselves, he says. What the fuck was I thinking? And I've been accused of putting ideas out there that make it less likely for victims to be willing to step forward. And my intent is to put some ideas out there that make it less likely for victims to be generated in the first place. And that's the context of what I said. That's why I said it. And thank you for listening.